This is Letter from America. Today's topic is the Dhiziri paChinhoyi anti-sanctions campaign is in shambles as the United States and European Union countries keep sanctions. The mindless and senseless campaign to lift sanctions against Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF, which has now robbed in SADC countries, has hit rock bottom. This campaign is now a mangled scrap heap after both the United States and the European Union stated that sanctions will stay on until Mnangagwa and the Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit respect the restoration of the rule of law and the human rights in Zimbabwe. The United States and European Union countries have stressed again and again that the sanctions are not against Zimbabwe as a country or Zimbabweans as a nation, but they are targeted at individuals in this Dhiziri paChinhoyi regime. In 2021, just last year, the United States provided over $317 million in bilateral assistance to support democracy and governance, agriculture, and health programming. In addition, the United States provided 51 million for humanitarian assistance to Zimbabwe. This cannot be said about a country that is said to have inflicted sanctions against the people of Zimbabwe. It is obvious from this humanitarian aid assistance to Zimbabweans that the United States restrictive measures, they are not sanctions, they are restrictive measures, are targeted against the criminal gang that is engaged in corruption, engaged in human atrocities, especially against the opposition supporters. The United States remains the largest provider of health and humanitarian assistance, including the United States President's Emergency Fund for AIDS relief, food assistance, and disaster relief to the people of Zimbabwe. Since Zimbabwe's independence in 1980, the United States government has provided over $3.5 billion to the people of Zimbabwe, including initiatives to increase food security, support economic resilience, improve health outcomes, and promote democratic governance. The Dhiziri paChinhoyi President Mnangagwa managed to evade Zimbabwe diaspora demonstrators in New York last week. It is reported he had beefed up security of more than 100 people, and he brought with him more than 200 hangers-on who were air freighted to New York at the Zimbabwean taxpayers' expense. But Mnangagwa suffered a double blow. The demonstrations by human rights activists against Mnangagwa at the United Nations last week were seen and heard through the social media networks far and wide around the whole world. These demonstrations brought to the attention of the international community the plight of the Zimbabweans, who are groaning under the iron heel of the ZANU-PF Mnangagwa regime's fascist dictatorship. Zimbabweans have never enjoyed the real freedom and democracy under the Mugabe Mnangagwa dictatorship. Their socio-economic situation, their lack of human rights, their lack of freedom is still the same, although some would say worse than during the Ian Smith settler colonial Rhodesia. There were reports that Mnangagwa had rented a ragtag group of homeless people in New York to demonstrate in support of Mnangagwa. He also met with a handful of sycophants masquerading as friends of ZANU-PF and told them Britain had to apologize to him for sanctions before he could sign the condolence book on the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Mnangagwa claimed he had been invited to the Queen's funeral, showing, as he put it, that Britain was now coming round to his view on sanctions. Mnangagwa had said the same things about the former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the Glasgow Summit on Climate Change. Mnangagwa also claimed that US President Joe Biden wanted to speak to him at the Glasgow Summit meeting on climate change. But Mnangagwa, said he would not go to Biden unless Biden came to him. Same with Boris Johnson. It turned out all of this were lies. Boris Johnson did not go to Mnangagwa, and a spokesman for Biden said Biden never met with Mnangagwa in Glasgow or had any conversation with him. The second blow to Mnangagwa was the United States and European Union stand firm that sanctions will stay until the rule of law and basic human rights are restored in Zimbabwe. This came after South African President Cyril Ramaphosa met with Biden and asked for sanctions to be removed, claiming they harmed the economies of the countries of the region. Other SADC leaders joined the call for sanctions to be removed. However, President Biden disagreed strongly with Ramaphosa. According to reports, Biden told Ramaphosa that he sympathized with South Africa's migration problem, but Biden strongly disagreed with Ramaphosa on the cause and solution to the issues in Zimbabwe. An official who was with Biden at the meeting with Ramaphosa said Biden made it clear that the issue is the behavior of the government of Zimbabwe. He said the United States is not seeking a regime change in Zimbabwe, but is concerned about the increasingly repressive environment inside Zimbabwe. The United States ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Ruben Bridgetti, said during a News 24 interview that the United States would be open to a change in the sanctions regime if there was a change in the repressive political environment inside Zimbabwe. And that is not news. That is the US law, and it is clear. Bridgetti told News 24 during an interview in Pretoria on Friday. The ZANU-PF propagandists were singing victory songs that the United States and Europe had now seen the light. They said the United States had extended an invitation to Mnangagwa to attend and participate at the US-Africa Summit scheduled for December in Washington, D.C. They also argued that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, had praised Zimbabwe's economic policies, but the IMF made it clear that it was not going to extend any new laws to Zimbabwe. As for Mnangagwa being invited to the US Africa Summit, not so fast. The United States made it clear that sanctions still apply to Mnangagwa. He is banned from coming to the United States unless at the invitation of the United Nations, where he is restricted to a radius of 25 miles in New York. The United States will, however, invite a representative from Zimbabwe who is not under the sanctions list. So, all that howling against sanctions and the so-called anti-sanctions day in October will only please Mnangagwa and the Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit. They are both nothing but hot blowing wind. No one else is listening to them. Anti-sanctions marches planned in certain countries have been a remarkable flop. The United States has made it clear that as long as the Dhiziri paChinhoyi regime of ZANU-PF and Mnangagwa does not respect the rule of law and basic human rights, sanctions will stay. They will not be removed. According to an online publication, US Ambassador Bridget said the United States did not believe in the ZANU-PF propaganda that sanctions have caused Zimbabwe's declining economy. The elephant in the room is corruption, which is costing Zimbabwe more than $1 billion US dollars every single year. Yet Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF are unwilling to talk about corruption or doing anything to stem corruption. Why? The answer is simple. It has now been established that top ZANU-PF officials are the beneficiaries of corruption in Zimbabwe today. Despite being implicated in the Auditor General's report and the existence of the so-called Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission or ZAC, not one top ZANU official is in jail for crimes that date back to more than 20 years. Not one. Mnangagwa is fond of making jokes about corruption. He is not serious at all about tackling the problem of corruption, which, as I said earlier, is the elephant in the room. At one ZANU-PF rally, Mnangagwa said he had been asked about corruption many times, especially during the late Mugabe regime. And this is what Mnangagwa said. I was about to answer, but I realized I was part of that government being accused of corruption, so I decided to keep quiet. At yet another rally, Mnangagwa said someone had sent him information implicating some corrupt government officials. Mnangagwa said his response was, "Shut the F up." It has become increasingly evident that Mnangagwa, the late Mugabe, and ZANU-PF are using sanctions as the cause of the country's economic meltdown. They are using sanctions because they don't want to talk about corruption, the real problem which they themselves have caused and they are benefiting from. Mnangagwa's propaganda has always been to describe sanctions as illegal. However, the only hopeful factor is that even many top ZANU-PF officials now privately accept that sanctions are not the cause of the economic malaise in Zimbabwe. They now accept it. A number of diplomats and officials from the United States and the European Union have repeatedly told Mugabe, the late Mugabe, and now Mnangagwa, that the economic problems for Zimbabwe are not caused by sanctions but by economic mismanagement by this ZANU Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit. The former and very outspoken United States ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols, said the Zimbabwe government should implement the necessary reforms in order for America to lift targeted sanctions imposed on some ZANU-PF members over alleged corruption and human rights violations. In an interview, Ambassador Nichols told Voice of America Zimbabwe service that the government's anti-sanctions campaign, backed by the SADC, won't help if there are no tangible reforms in the country. In that same interview, Ambassador Nichols was very blunt in his message directed to the ZANU-PF Dhiziri paChinhoyi regime. Nichols said bluntly that the SADC anti-sanctions campaign, orchestrated by the government of Zimbabwe, is really an effort to distract the people of Zimbabwe from the real causes of Zimbabwe's profound causes. The government of Zimbabwe would be better served by focusing on its efforts on implementing reforms that it campaigned on. That is to say, deepening democracy, combating corruption, increasing respect for human rights, and opening up the economy for transparent trade and investment. Those are the things that will make the average Zimbabwean's lives better, Ambassador Nichols said. Ambassador Nichols also said America has been pressing the Zimbabwe government to implement all the necessary reforms. Ambassador Nichols added, "Our goal, that is the US goal, is for the nation of Zimbabwe to succeed, and we believe by pursuing reforms that the Mnangagwa administration campaigned on, this country could succeed." Ambassador Nichols went on, we, the United States, have consistently pressed the government of Zimbabwe to implement the necessary political, democratic, and economic reforms consistent with the international human rights obligations to provide Zimbabwean citizens the prosperity, security, and well-being that they deserve. If those things happen, Ambassador Nichols advised, there would be no need for further sanctions. Another former United States ambassador to Zimbabwe, Christopher Dale, said he regretted that the relationship between the United States and Zimbabwe is strained, a situation that he blamed on changes in the Zimbabwe government policy. Since independence, Ambassador Dale said, the government of Zimbabwe under Mugabe had moved away from respect for democracy, human rights, property, and rules of the market economy. Ambassador Dale told reporter Safari Njema of Voice of America that he disagreed with the allegations by the government of the late President Robert Mugabe that sanctions by the West are behind the country's deteriorating economy. Ambassador Dale said it is Harare's policies that discourage foreign investment, not sanctions, that are contributing to the country's economic decline. Ambassador Dell said that Western sanctions are limited and targeted against, for example, 86 ruling party leaders and not the country as a whole. He added that the United States has spent $300 million in food aid to Zimbabwe over the past 5 years, and that the United States government, unlike that of Zimbabwe, does not use food as a weapon. Ambassador Dell said less than 100 Zimbabweans are on the targeted sanctions, which were imposed in 2003 following alleged human rights violations and election rigging. Ambassador Dell added, "I think it's important to stress that the United States does not have sanctions against the economy or the people of Zimbabwe. Our sanctions target those who engage in corruption, violate human rights, and undermine the democratic processes in Zimbabwe. In fact, our sanctions, that is the US sanctions, have only 83 individuals and 37 entities. That is to say, companies or organizations linked to those people that have either committed human rights abuses or engaged in corruption. They undermine the democratic spaces here in Zimbabwe. That is our concern, and we are trying to point out that feeling in our program of targeted sanctions." That was former ambassador to Zimbabwe, Ambassador Dell. What boggles the mind is that Zimbabwe, the Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit of Mnangagwa, is being asked to respect human rights and the rule of law as a condition for the lifting of sanctions. That's all that they are being asked to. Nothing could be simpler than this requirement. As a matter of fact, when the US Congress passed the Dhiziri bill in 2002, it included more than $20 million to help Zimbabwe to return to the rule of law and respect for human rights.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for